In Planet Reddit, today's story is...
My fiancé chose his best friend over me on our wedding day. I never imagined that a 5-year relationship would end in public humiliation and unforgivable betrayal. Okay, Reddit, I need to vent. What happened at my wedding was so incredibly upsetting that I'm still trying to process it. I'm going to explain it from the beginning because context is important. To give you some background, I, female, 28, have been with Jacob, male, 30, for 5 years. We met at university, dated during our last 2 years, and have been planning our wedding for the last 18 months. Everything seemed perfect. Jacob's best friend, Brian, male, 31, had been his closest friend since high school. They were practically brothers. Brian was going to be his best man, and I always tried to get along with his friendship, even when I sometimes felt left out. The months leading up to the wedding were stressful but exciting. We had chosen a beautiful venue in upstate New York, invited about 150 guests, and spent countless hours planning every detail. My parents had contributed significantly to the budget, and my entire extended family was traveling from all over the country. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a big family reunion. Let me tell you more about Brian. He and Jacob had been extremely close since high school. They had been through everything together. Jacob had helped Brian through his parents' difficult divorce, and Brian had supported Jacob when he was having difficulties at the start of his career. Their friendship was legendary among their group of friends. I always respected that, although Brian's jokes sometimes seemed to cross certain boundaries. Brian's presence in our relationship was something I had learned to tolerate. He was the kind of person who became the center of attention and loved to push boundaries with the excuse of humor. For example, when Jacob and I first moved in together, Brian would jokingly refer to our apartment as if it were his too. At first it was funny, but the joke became annoying when he started turning up unannounced or staying on our sofa after a night out with Jacob. I mentioned it once to Jacob, and he said I was being dramatic and that Brian was just comfortable with us. But over time, those boundaries became harder to ignore. Brian had this habit of getting into situations that didn't concern him. At the beginning of our relationship, he would make little jokes at my expense disguised as humor. If I cooked dinner for Jacob, Brian would make a big show of tasting it and exaggeratingly pretending to be disgusted, saying something like, "It's a good thing Jacob has me or he'd starve." Everyone would laugh, and I would smile to cover it up, but it hurt. When Jacob proposed to me, I thought things would change. I expected Brian to take a step back and respect this new stage in our lives. But if anything, his involvement increased. He made sure he was part of the planning process, getting involved in decisions that were not his to make. He organized the bachelor party without consulting me and insisted on making jokes about how marriage was the end of freedom for Jacob. There was an incident during the planning that still infuriates me. Jacob and I had a disagreement about the guest list. He wanted to invite some old acquaintances from university, while I thought the list was already complete. I later discovered that Brian had been encouraging Jacob, saying things like, "Is it your wedding or just hers? And don't let her control you, buddy." When I confronted Jacob about it, he shrugged and said, "Brian's just being protective." I felt like every decision I made had to be run past Brian for approval. The rehearsal dinner was the first big wake-up call. Brian gave a toast that was uncomfortably personal. He talked about embarrassing stories from Jacob's past, making jokes that seemed more like deliberate attempts to humiliate him than friendly banter. I remember catching the uncomfortable look on my future mother-in-law's face and thinking that maybe I was overreacting. But then Brian made a joke about how Jacob had always needed him to fix his problems and how he hoped I would keep him in check now that Brian was stepping down. The room laughed nervously, but I felt a knot in my stomach. It didn't seem like a joke. That night I mentioned it to Jacob. He ignored me, saying that Brian was probably just nervous about giving a speech and didn't mean anything by it. I let it go, telling myself that I should focus on what was important, our wedding day. The morning of the wedding was very intense. I was surrounded by my bridesmaids, my mother and my cousins, all helping me get ready. The venue looked stunning, exactly as I had imagined it. For a moment I allowed myself to feel emotional. My family and friends were here, and I was about to marry the man I loved. Then it all came crashing down. My cousin took me aside, looking uncomfortable. She handed me her phone, showing me a group message that Brian had sent to several of the groomsmen. In it, Brian claimed that I had been unfaithful to Jacob during our engagement and that Jacob was only going through with the wedding out of obligation. My heart sank. The accusations were completely false, but the malice behind them was undeniable. Somehow, the messages had spread beyond the groomsmen. Guests were whispering, and the atmosphere was filled with tension. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and furious, all at once. I went straight to find Jacob. He was in a side room with Brian, laughing about something. Without hesitation, I walked into the room and held up my phone, showing Jacob the messages Brian had sent. I could barely speak and hoped Jacob was as furious as I was, if not more so. I thought he would immediately confront Brian, demanding to know why his best friend would spread such a horrible lie about me on what was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. Instead, Jacob barely looked at the screen before rolling his eyes. "Brian's just joking," he said nonchalantly, as if it were no big deal. "You're overreacting. Exaggerating." That word hit me like a slap in the face. My fiancé, the person I was about to marry, was not upset with me. He was not horrified by what his best man had done. He was not even remotely concerned about how I felt. Instead, he dismissed it as if it were just another one of Brian's harmless jokes, as if it were my problem for being upset. I couldn't believe it. I stared at him, waiting for some sign that he understood how wrong this all was, but he just kept talking. Then he accused me of always being strict with Brian, that I never liked him, and that he was just looking for an excuse to ruin the atmosphere. Ruining the atmosphere. My mind was working at full speed. Not only was Jacob not defending me, but he was also turning this around, making it seem like I was the one causing trouble. Then he said something that really hurt. "You've always been jealous of our friendship," he added, as if this whole situation was just about some petty rivalry I had invented. I felt something inside me break. This wasn't just about Brian anymore. This was about Jacob. If I couldn't stand up for myself on our wedding day, if I couldn't see how deeply they were hurting me, what kind of couple would we be in marriage? This was supposed to be the day we supported each other. The day we promised to support each other through everything. And yet here I was, being treated as if my pain didn't even matter. I went back to the bridal suite, grabbed my things and left. My bridesmaids and my family were confused, but I couldn't bring myself to explain everything at that moment. I just knew I couldn't go through with it. I took my belongings, told my bridesmaids I needed a moment alone, and then I just left the venue. Since then, everything has been a mess. My father hasn't spoken to me at all. He's furious, and I understand why. From his perspective, I left the wedding without warning, leaving everyone confused and embarrassed. My mother has tried to get in touch with me, but even she seems unsure whether I made the right decision. Some members of my extended family have called or sent messages, and those who are not directly angry with me are still upset about the family's reputation. They think I overreacted and made a mountain out of a molehill. Jacob, meanwhile, has been leaving me voicemails almost every day. At first, his messages were angry. He accused me of humiliating him in front of everyone and ruining his life. Then they turned to apologies, but even those felt empty. He kept saying it was just a joke, that Brian didn't mean any harm, and that I needed to let it go. He kept asking me to go back and fix things, but how could I? How could I fix something that felt so fundamentally broken? And then there's Brian, whose audacity is almost comical. He had the nerve to send me a message calling me a drama queen and accusing me of ruining Jacob's big day, as if he hadn't played a big part in blowing it up. He made it sound like I was the problem, as if my refusal to laugh at his cruel joke was a massive character flaw. Now, sitting here, I feel a mixture of relief and doubt. Was I right to leave? Was it just a joke that I took too seriously? Reddit, am I the one who's wrong for leaving Jacob at the altar? Did I overreact? Or was this the only option I had to protect my dignity? Update 1. Hello, Reddit. First of all, thank you for all the overwhelming support and comments on my initial post. It's been a roller coaster ride since I left the wedding. And although I'm still processing everything, I decided it was important to talk to my family and clarify the situation. I know how it must have looked to them, me disappearing on my wedding day without a proper explanation. I owed them that at least, even if I wasn't ready to face the chaos that was brewing on Jacob's side. A couple of days after the wedding, I went to visit my parents. My mom and dad have always been understanding, but this was a whole new level of awkwardness. My dad in particular had taken Jacob under his wing when we got engaged. He was always bragging about Jacob to his friends, saying how he was delighted to have a son-in-law he could connect with. I knew how much they had invested emotionally and financially in the wedding, so I was nervous about how they would react to all this. When I arrived, my mom greeted me with a hug, but my dad barely looked at me. He was sitting on the sofa pretending to check his phone, but I could tell he was upset. I didn't blame him. To them, it must have seemed like I had just thrown everything away on a whim. But I also knew that once they heard the whole story, they would understand. I sat them down and explained everything. Brian's years of manipulative and disrespectful behavior, the group chat messages, Jacob's total lack of support, and how it all came to a head on the day of the wedding. I apologized for not explaining earlier, for leaving them in the dark while I was trying to assimilate everything myself. My mom listened attentively, and when I finished, she let out a long sigh, as if she had been holding her breath the whole time. To my surprise, my dad was the first to speak. He admitted that he was disappointed, but not in me, but in Jacob. He said he had thought Jacob was a man of integrity, someone who would protect and support me, and he felt betrayed by how Jacob had handled everything. Then she said something that really struck me. "You left at the right time. It's better to have a bad day than a lifetime of regret." My mom nodded and added that she couldn't imagine what she would have gone through if she had gone ahead with the wedding. She admitted that she had always felt uncomfortable with Brian's influence over Jacob, but she didn't want to intrude by saying anything. Hearing that was a relief, as if I wasn't crazy for feeling left out all these years. They were disappointed, of course, but not with me, and disappointed in how Jacob had turned out to be someone who couldn't prioritize his partner over his best friend. My parents even offered to contact my siblings to help explain everything, which was a huge weight off my shoulders. By the time I left, I felt lighter. My dad gave me a hug before I walked out the door and said I would always have them, no matter what. Maybe I realized that even though things had gone horribly wrong, I wasn't as alone as I felt in that bridal suite. On the other hand, my phone has been full of missed calls and messages. Jacob has called dozens of times, leaving long voice messages apologizing and saying we could work things out if I would just come home. I haven't responded. I'm not ready, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever be ready to hear his excuses. Jacob's family, however, has not held back. They have been calling and texting nonstop, furious that I shamed him in front of everyone. One of his aunts even messaged me on Facebook, accusing me of ruining the life of a good man. Some of the wedding guests have also been in touch, demanding an explanation as to why the ceremony was abruptly canceled. I have been ignoring most of them, but the audacity of some people is astounding. And then there's Brian. Of course, he couldn't resist getting in on the drama. From what I've heard, he's been telling anyone who will listen that I left because I couldn't handle the pressure of the wedding. He's presenting himself as the loyal friend who was trying to help Jacob see the truth about me. It would be almost funny if it weren't so frustrating. One of my bridesmaids, Sarah, actually confronted him after the wedding. She told me he was arrogant and unrepentant, saying he didn't regret sending those messages because someone had to say it. The audacity of that man is unbelievable. Sarah tried to defend me, but Brian simply ignored her, saying I was too sensitive and that Jacob deserved someone who could take a joke. I've also been gathering more details about what happened after I left. Apparently, the atmosphere at the venue was in complete chaos. My parents and some close friends left discreetly when they realized I wasn't coming back, but Jacob's family stayed and turned it into a blame game. Some of the best men were overheard whispering about the text Brian had sent, and the news spread quickly among the guests. Jacob was supposedly frantic, alternating between anger and panic, while Brian stood by his side acting as a savior. It's really strange how Jacob can't see Brian for who he really is. Brian's actions were cruel and calculated, but Jacob still sees him as the guy who has always supported him. It's as if he is blind to the damage Brian has caused. Right now, I'm taking things one day at a time. My family has been incredibly supportive, and my siblings have rallied around me. Some of my friends have also reached out, saying they noticed how Brian treated me over the years, but they didn't want to intrude. It's comforting to know that I'm not crazy for feeling the way I did all this time. I don't know what's next. Part of me feels relieved to have dodged a bullet, but another part of me is mourning the life I thought I was going to have. I loved Jacob, Or at least a version of him that I thought I knew, but now I can't help but wonder if this has always been who he is. A man who would let his best friend humiliate the woman he supposedly loves. For now, I'm focusing on rebuilding. I've blocked Jacob and Brian on all social media and silenced their numbers. I don't know if I'll ever answer Jacob's calls, but I do know one thing. I deserve better than this. Update 2. Hi guys, I wanted to start by saying thank you. I've been reading your comments and messages, and I'm truly grateful for all the advice and support. It's been a whirlwind of emotions, and having so many strangers validate my decision has helped me more than I can express. That said, I saw some comments from people who thought I overreacted by leaving Jacob and walking out of the wedding. To those people, let me respectfully say I disagree. Ending a 5-year relationship was not something I did lightly. This was not just about a comment from Brian. It was not even just about Jacob's reaction that day. It was about a pattern of behavior that I had been tolerating for years, hoping that things would change. Every time I mentioned how Brian's comments made me feel, Jacob dismissed me, telling me to relax or stop thinking too much. It was always me who had to adjust, relax, stop being so sensitive, while Brian kept crossing line after line. And Jacob, he always took Brian's side, or even worse, ignored him completely. Leaving wasn't about ruining Jacob's life, as some people have claimed. It was about reclaiming my own. I realized that if I didn't set a boundary now, I would spend the rest of my life swallowing my discomfort, being told to relax, and putting up with behavior that made me feel small and disrespected. That's not the kind of marriage I want, and, frankly, it's not the kind of marriage anyone deserves. In any case, since my brothers found out what really happened that day, they've been my greatest allies. They've clarified the situation for some of the wedding guests who were confused or misinformed, including some of the groomsmen. Apparently, some of them weren't even aware of the group chat messages Brian sent before the wedding. Once they saw the screenshots, a couple of them actually apologized to me. It was a relief to know that not everyone was blindly on Jacob and Brian's side. One of Jacob's cousins even got in touch to say that she had always thought that Brian had an unhealthy influence on Jacob, but she didn't feel it was her place to say anything. Hearing that was validating because it made me realize that this dynamic wasn't just in my head. Brian's behavior had been a problem for years, but everyone just accepted it as part of being around Jacob. Since the wedding, things have calmed down a bit, but it hasn't been easy. The accusations and blame that were thrown at me have thankfully started to subside. At first, Jacob's family was furious, angry with me for leaving, and I thought they would never let it go. But gradually, the intensity of their anger cooled. Some people who had been quick to blame me have since contacted me with messages of apology, admitting that they jumped to conclusions without knowing the full story. Honestly, it felt a bit like too little, too late, but I appreciated the effort. The situation is still exhausting, however. It's not just the angry calls and messages I'm dealing with. Jacob has been relentless in trying to contact me. He's been leaving long voicemails, sending handwritten letters to my parents' house, and even showing up at my door. He says he's sorry, that he was taken by surprise by my decision, and he keeps begging for us to talk and work it out. But the truth is, I don't see how talking would change anything. Trust has been shattered, and I'm not sure I can ever rebuild it. The idea of having another conversation with him feels like it would drag me back to all the pain and frustration that I've been trying to move on from. One of the hardest things to deal with has been the financial consequences. It's been a disaster. Most of the suppliers were understanding about the situation and didn't give me much trouble for canceling at the last minute. But the truth is that wedding expenses are rarely refundable. Since everything was paid for in advance, most of the money has essentially been lost. I have been saving for this wedding for over a year, and although my parents helped out a little, most of the costs fell on me. Things like the venue, the food, the flowers, the photographer, the bills, they add up quickly. Now it feels like it's all just gone, and there's not much I can do to get it back. The only small consolation is that we hadn't signed the marriage license yet, so there's no legal marriage to dissolve. That's something I tried to remind myself of when I was getting frustrated with the financial loss. But it doesn't make it hurt any less. Talking to my parents about the money situation was really difficult. I hated having to bring it up, especially with everything else that had already gone wrong. I felt guilty that they were also losing money that they had helped contribute. My dad, as always, was the calm and rational one. He told me not to worry, that my happiness and peace of mind were worth much more than any amount of money. I appreciated their support, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to make things right. My mom agreed, but she also said that we would figure it out together and that my well-being mattered much more. Although they both told me not to stress about it, I insisted that I would pay them back over time. It's not something I can easily forget, and although it may take a while to pay them back, I am determined to do so. I don't want my parents to suffer a financial blow because of this, especially since they were only trying to help make my dreams come true. I can help make my dream wedding come true. As for Jacob, I have made a conscious decision not to mention the financial side of things with him. Just thinking about having a conversation with him right now feels like an emotional weight I can't bear. Honestly, talking to him about anything is exhausting at this point, and the idea of adding money to the mix feels like it would only complicate things even more. I don't trust myself to be fair or reasonable about it. I still can't shake the feeling that Brian's influence is still present in the background. And if I had a conversation with Jacob about finances, it would probably turn into another battle that I don't need. I have decided that for my own peace of mind, I am going to handle the financial consequences with the support of my family, and that's it. I don't want to involve Jacob in this process. It's already too much. I have been staying with my parents temporarily, which has been comforting but also a bit surreal. Some friends have also been in touch to see how I am, and I have started to realize who my true friends are. A couple of people I thought were close to me haven't said a word since the wedding. Probably because they are still in Jacob's camp. It hurts, but I'd rather know who is really on my side than maintain fake friendships. Little by little, I'm starting to rebuild. I've been looking into therapy to work through all of this, and I've started keeping a journal to process my thoughts. It's a long road ahead, but I'm sure I made the right decision. I've learned a lot about myself in the last few weeks, and one thing I know for sure is that I deserve a partner who respects me, defends me, and doesn't allow anyone to treat me like a joke. Update 3. Hi guys, it's been almost 2 weeks since the whole wedding day incident. And while I can't say that everything is magically better, I'm okay. Life has been slowly settling into a new normal. Some days are harder than others, but I'm learning to take things one step at a time. Things haven't changed too much, but there have been some changes. I recently moved out of my parents' house. Don't get me wrong, they've been amazing throughout all of this. But after a few weeks back in my childhood bedroom, I started to feel like I needed my own space again. Fortunately, one of my close friends had been looking for a flatmate, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Moving in with her has been a breath of fresh air. It's nice to have a bit of independence again and someone to talk to who doesn't remind me of the wedding fiasco every 5 minutes. Unfortunately, Jacob hasn't let go completely. He's still been contacting me, and although his tone has changed, it's still exhausting. At first, his messages were defensive, full of excuses and justifications, but now his apologies are, well, I guess you could say they're finally going in the right direction. He's admitted that he was wrong to take Brian's side. He told my parents that he had cut all ties with him. He even went as far as to say that he wished he had seen through Brian's behavior earlier and that he should have put me first. I'm not going to lie. It was a little satisfying to hear that he finally understood, but it doesn't change much. Apologies are great, but they don't erase years of dismissing my feelings or the betrayal I felt on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. It's like trying to rebuild a house after the foundations have collapsed. You can't just put on a fresh coat of paint and call it fixed. Jacob's persistence has been difficult to handle. My parents have made it clear to him that there is no going back from this, but he keeps asking them where I am, hoping for another chance. It's frustrating because I don't know how many ways I can say we're over before he gets it. After thinking about it, I decided it would be best to address this directly. I wrote an email to Jacob. I felt it was the safest way to communicate without getting into another exhausting conversation. In the email, I laid everything out. I told him he needs to stop involving my parents and badgering them for information. I made it clear that we are over, that nothing I say or do will change my mind. I also warned him that if he continues with this behavior, I will have to take serious action. I didn't want to sound harsh, but I needed to set firm boundaries. I have also been dealing with some of Jacob's relatives, which has been quite an experience, to say the least. Some of them contacted me, claiming that they just wanted to hear my side of the story, but honestly, Their tone made it clear that they were more interested in judging me than in understanding what really happened. After a few days of ignoring their calls and messages, I finally blew my top and replied to a couple of them. I told them, plainly and simply, that they didn't need to worry about me losing a good man because a good man wouldn't have let things get this far. I also reminded them that, even though they may see Jacob as perfect, they weren't the ones who had to endure years of being ignored and made to feel like a stranger in my own relationship. It felt good to stand my ground, even if I doubt it will change their opinion of me. I have also started to focus more on myself, which feels strange but also refreshing. For a long time I was involved in planning the wedding and trying to keep everyone else happy. Now I finally have the time and space to discover what I want. To everyone here on Reddit who has supported me along the way, thank you, seriously. The avalanche of advice, kind words, and even tough love has been overwhelming in the best sense. It has helped me see that I'm not crazy, that I'm not overreacting, and that it's okay to stand up for myself, even if it means making a difficult and painful decision. I know there is still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time I feel hopeful. This chapter of my life might not have ended the way I thought it would, but maybe that's a good thing. I'm learning that sometimes walking away isn't giving up, it's choosing yourself, and that feels pretty good.